You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm sitting down virtually, of course, with Natalie Russ, who is a clinical psychologist that comes to us from Massachusetts, USA. Did I say that right? That's how you say it? So, Natalie, you come to me because we're going to talk about your therapy harm project. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how you come to be doing that work?
Sure. So, I suppose I'll start by saying that I experienced a 12-year harmful therapy starting when I was an adolescent and spanning until I was in training to be a therapist in my late 20s. And so I've never been a therapist who wasn't catastrophically harmed by therapy. So that's how I entered the field. And I think there was something really galvanizing about being part of this field, sitting in classes, sitting in consultation groups, sitting in peer support spaces, and realizing that nobody was talking about therapy harm. Many people had never even thought about it or heard about it. It had never come up in training. And often finding myself the only person in the room thinking about it, reacting to it, trying to speak to it, that really led me pretty directly into this work. The Therapy Harm Resistance Project is a new iteration of that. But this has been the kind of cornerstone of my life in the field since I got here.
I would imagine. I did try and take psychology at one point. I was going to study to become a counselor, and I got through half of the first course, and then I couldn't do it anymore. I just literally could not sit there quietly learning about dead white men's ideas about what mental health was. And of course, I'm talking about Jung and Freud and all of those people. But I'm imagining you sitting, having experienced therapy harm and sitting as a young adult in psychology classes and really having some dissonance about what you experienced as opposed to what you were being taught.
Yeah, I mean, quite literally, sometimes I had come from harmful therapy sessions, gone in my car, driven to school, and gone to class to learn about how wonderful we all are and how much we're helping everybody.
Wow.
And that contrast was pretty psychologically difficult to tolerate. I would say that the experience of going through grad school with this experience running in the background was in its own way an additional, just as significant trauma to the actual therapy harm.
I would imagine it would be a little bit crazy making too.
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about your therapy harm that you experienced?
Yeah, so I went to boarding school when I was 15. I'm originally from New York, and I came to Massachusetts for boarding school. And I got into therapy when I was 15 with someone in the area near the school. And I would say that, this is not an often talked about type of therapy harm, I think. It's not the stereotype that we hear about, but the maternal kind of dynamic that can form that can be just as violating in many ways as what's more often talked about, which is the sexual form. Not in any way to minimize any type of exploitation, but this took on much more of a you're my child, you're more like my child than my children, keeping the therapy very intense, keeping the therapy very frequent, a lot of physical contact, and not sexual, but this nurturing kind of the best word for it would be maternal type of energy that, many people would be longing for, that I was longing for, and didn't understand until I was myself training to be a therapist that it wasn't supposed to be happening.
So would you, not all, well, I guess when you say typical, we're talking about a sexual boundary violation in the therapy. I'm finding that in the work that I do, because I'm a mental health advocate outside of being a radio host, and a lot of the abuse that we're hearing about is not always sexual. And in fact, the fact that the sexual part of it is criminal and yada yada, it makes it harder for other people to come forward, like you're talking about. Would you say that what you went through is an emotional harm?
Yeah, I think of it as psychological, emotional. There were physical boundary crossings, just not sexual
Mm-hmm.
physical boundary crossings. But I would say when it ended, I ended up feeling almost brainwashed. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily assign that intention to her consciously, but certainly that's what happened. It almost felt as though I was living inside of her. And when the therapy came apart, that I re-entered the world. So it was very all-encompassing, incredibly occupying, I would say colonizing of myself.
Mm.
And I really was unable to parse it, um, you know, until really the very end, 12 years in.
So when you say parse it, what did that mean for you?
I went to grad school and I was starting to practice in training sites, internship.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very clear that therapy was actually something quite different from what was going on in my therapy. And I had never had any other therapy before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it started to sort of emerge in my thinking, this is not what I'm being taught to do. This is not what I'm doing. This is not what anybody else is doing. Um, and I would bring those questions in to my therapy because I was under the impression that I was actually welcome to do that. But the reaction that I got from her was um, rejection and hostility. And that's when the whole thing started to unravel. I think I was no longer meeting her needs at that point because I was starting to question the frame, and not simply sort of stay in the role of, adoring pseudo child that she
Mm-hmm.
had me.
Yeah, and it's so often that it is that point where somebody is questioning and coming in and saying, hey, what about, or this makes me feel not so good, that the I call them abusive therapists, sort of makes a sort of a direct turn and starts to be angry and attacking and threatening and all kinds of things,
Mhm.
depending on whatever level of harm that's happening there. Um, what you went through, I would think and believe and know that there are many people out there who would love to be in therapy with somebody who would sort of absorb them into their emotional sphere and love them and care for them as if they were their child. Why is that problematic?
Well, it's problematic because it's based on a fantasy that is not the truth of what the therapeutic relationship is and can be in a safe way.
Mm-hmm.
So it may feel wonderful, it may meet deep needs, um, for both client and therapist. But that's not what therapy is, and that's not what therapy is for. And it's not safe. It's not safe to go into this fantasy of the mother-child relationship or any other fantasy that can develop between two people in the therapeutic frame and live inside of that. It almost always, I think, always backfires catastrophically on the
Mm-hmm.
client.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the boundaries are for the protection of the client. And in earnest, the therapist, but that's not the point. The boundaries are for the protection of the client, and um, because they hold up what can be safely um, enacted in this relationship, in this type of relationship.
Mm-hmm. I ask these questions because a lot of folks talk about, the whole notion of how can therapy be healing if one person isn't able to be a human in it. And that's how it's kind of framed, right? And so to be human, you have to be available and vulnerable and open and sharing and all of those things that we know therapists are that those are transgressions of boundaries, that those are not things that necessarily that the therapist should be doing unless it's therapeutic necessary, and most times it's not. And it's a hard thing to try to describe to people who are clients, who are people who've been victimized, or people who are looking for a relationship, why it's important that your therapist not be your friend. Why was it important for your therapist not to become your mother, your pseudo mother?
Well, any number of reasons. The ones that float to the top of my mind are, first of all, the idea that she was my mother was coming from primarily her fantasy. I actually didn't expect any of that.
Mm-hmm.
I was not thinking, um, that could happen. Each boundary that she crossed, I was surprised by, and some combination of confused, terrified, and delighted.
Mm-hmm.
It was not my expectation. And so each time I would ask, you're allowed to do this, we're allowed to do this. And she would give me some explanation about why it was okay, who she'd consulted with, that it was valid and legitimate. Um, but that she was saying directly, there's something I get from an egoic place, thinking of you as my child that I like, that I want. And so it was actually theft. So that's the first problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that it was theft.
It was her
Um,
need. It wasn't your
yes,
need. Yeah.
correct. And what it
Yeah.
did was prevent me from grappling with truth, with
Mm-hmm.
the realities of my life, my circumstances, the things that I did and didn't have from people in my life, the ways that I could and couldn't get my needs met. She
Mm-hmm.
came in with a very strong kind of prophet, savior fantasy that, in fact, I didn't need to grieve any of those things because she was able, with, her font of love, to provide those things for me.
So she circumvented your own healing process, really, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Right. I call that lazy. And I often talk to people about how, if you are client coming into your therapy session and saying, I don't feel loved, if the therapist steps in and says, no, 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 I love you, what happens is you no longer get to deal with that feeling that may be historical in your life and very real and very valid and something that you need to process to move on and be able to develop loving, caring relationships in your own life. What happens is the therapist just steps in and stops it cold because you can no longer say, I feel unloved, because this person in front of you has done this extraordinary thing of saying, I love you. And
Mhm.
what you are saying is so valid, which is that it's not real. She wasn't your mother. You had real issues that you needed to deal with. And so it's the same thing. It's lazy and it's not real and it circumvents the processing for people, which is diabolical on some level. And certainly for you, having this person sort of step in as your parent. Were you able to ever talk to the people as you were going through training about what happened, or not necessarily talk about what happened to you, but just sort of confront them on these things that you were weighing and juggling as you were going through training?
Yes, and in fact, I couldn't stop talking about it, because the project that had been handed to me of having to figure out if and how to be a therapist with abusive therapy happening to me, and really only abusive therapy ever having happened to me,
Mm-hmm.
as far as a model of my own experience in therapy, the project was so daunting that I really didn't stop talking. I was talking to anyone and everyone who would engage me on the topic in classes and supervision, and with mixed results. Some really thoughtful and interested people, many people who had never thought about it, and some people who were really defensive about it.
We're going to just stop right there, folks, but we're going to come back and continue that conversation in a minute. So we'll be right back.
The National Greening Program run by Tree Canada is dedicated to planting seedling trees across Canada in BC, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic. They prioritize planting on Indigenous and public lands and planting in areas of natural or human-caused disaster. The trees they plant help filter the air and water and sequester carbon, among other positive impacts. To learn more or get involved, go to treecanada.ca.
I am not okay. I'm barely getting by. I'm losing track of days, losing sleep at night. I am not okay. I'm hanging on the rails. So if I say I'm fine, just know I learned to hide it well. I know I can't be the only one who's holding on for dear life. But God knows, I know when it's all said and done, I'm not okay, but it's all gonna be alright. It's not okay, but we're all gonna be alright. I woke up today, I almost stayed in bed, had the devil on my back and voices in my head. Some days it ain't all bad, some days it all gets worse. Some days I swear I'm better off laying in that dirt. I know I can't be the only one who's holding on for dear life. But God knows, I know when it's all said and done, I'm not okay, but it's all gonna be alright. It's not okay, but we're all gonna be alright. Gonna be alright. Gonna be alright. I know one day we'll see the other side. The pain will wash away in a holy water tide, and we all gonna be alright. I know I can't be the only one who's holding on for dear life. But God knows, I know when it's all said and done, I'm not okay, but it's all gonna be alright. It's not okay, but we're all gonna be alright. I'm not okay, but it's all gonna be alright.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox speaking with Natalie Russ about therapy harm. Natalie, you were talking about how you couldn't stop talking about it as you were being trained to become a psychologist. And you said there were mixed responses to it. Can you tell us what those mixed responses were?
Yeah, I think I was lucky enough to be surrounded by some peers and supervisors who were really open and thoughtful and humble. And I also met with some defensiveness from some who I think were primarily very invested in feeling like therapy is inherently good and therapists are inherently good. And so hearing a story like mine was a challenge to that notion. There were some attempts to kind of frame my story as just some bad apples, as a framework for understanding therapy harm, right? That therapy is inherently good, but there are, of course, going to be some bad ones. And I was, not satisfied with that framework, because it seemed like the role of the ego was so prominent in what I was experiencing in the culture of the field coming into the field, that it just didn't seem like a bad apples framework was sufficient to explain this phenomenon.
So define ego for our audience.
Oh, I have absolutely no idea how to do that.
Okay. I kind of threw all that stuff out, but my sense of it is that it is about sense of self. It's about elevated sense of self. That's how I interpret it, and I'm probably wrong, and somebody's probably going to write in and say, no, that's not what it is, and that's okay. So certainly write in. Did you have anybody tell you that it was okay what she was doing?
I had, well, no, it was egregious enough in the telling that no one quite took that tack, but I did get some responses, if I'm remembering, and of course this was a decade ago, but I did get some responses that sounded like, well, she probably really loves you and really wants to, from a legitimizing of her position and her behavior.
So an excuse of what was going on, making it somehow okay that you should kind of accept what it is. Did they at the same time ask you how it was impacting on you? Or was that something you were already kind of clear about?
I was often explaining that I was psychologically traumatized and pretty much destroyed. It was an enormous trauma, and I think it was palpable and visible that I was not okay at this point, and that was part of why I was talking about it so much. And I think so there was some equivocating. There was, of course, she probably doesn't intend this to be so damaging to you, but it makes sense that it is, and it's her, she's valid, you're valid, all of that stuff.
Right. Sort of middle of the road, threading of the needle, everybody's okay. You shouldn't think badly of her, blah, blah, blah. You talk about catastrophic damage and how much it impacted on you. And one of the things that I've been finding as I talk about this issue along the way is that I find that there is a real dearth of information provided to therapists, and you might be able to speak to this as well, that they get trained very clearly, very quickly on what the ethical guidelines are, what the boundaries are, what you are and are not supposed to do. But there doesn't seem to be any training on what happens to the client if you do those things. And so the absence of that description of impact implies that there is no impact, that nothing really happens, that really the only way this whole issue impacts on anybody is you. If you get caught, you're going to lose your license, yada, yada. You went through training. Were you taught what happens to the client if people transgress their boundaries?
Absolutely not.
And so, of course, this is the dissonance. You're sitting there catastrophically damaged on some level and being trained, but nobody is talking about what happened to you. Can you talk a little bit here about what happened to you, how it impacted on you?
Yeah, I can try. Of course, I think with trauma like this, of course, it all gets very fractured and it's hard to feel like you've captured everything, right? It's one piece here, one piece there. I think the thing I often feel doesn't get understood as well is the damage that happens on the inside when a therapist has been internalized so deeply. So I was 15 when I met her, and I was away at boarding school, and I attached myself like a duckling, and in many ways I made myself out of this person, right? I built my inner life of her. And so when she rejected me, when she became hostile, when she turned quote unquote turned bad, though, I understand now that it's a classic cycle of idealization and discard that happens
Mhm.
in these types of abuse situations. But when my experience of having been, her beloved, adored, such and such, and then all of a sudden being the hated, evil, have to throw out object. When that happened, those pieces of her inside of me corrupted. And so the real crime scene was on the inside. I couldn't figure out uh, anything about myself for a period of time. I didn't understand what was good, what was bad. Did I even really know what love meant, what it didn't mean? It turned out that what I had thought was love was abuse. And
Mhm.
I had a lot of paranoia about that. And it was, generally difficult to get through the day. It all felt pretty um, bizarre and detached. Like, what am I even doing walking around?
Right.
Um, having been blown up on the inside in this way.
And that's the right term, blown up. The real crime scene was on the inside. All of that stuff is so kind of standard for what happens to clients who have been harmed in this way. And it's one of the things that the world just doesn't, like I said about the training, they just don't seem to understand the catastrophic damage that happens to a client who has been turned on by their therapist. Do you see her turning on you? It's sort of in the same way we see what happens with say abusers, spousal abusers who do the same thing. They have this honeymoon phase, and then they turn, and then the abuse happens, and then they go back to a honeymoon phase. So in that turning, it seems like the same thing, although I don't see in therapy harm or therapy abuse the cycle repeating itself over and over. Did that happen at all for you?
Yes. And one really complicated element was that she was talking to me about cycles of rupture and repair in
Mm,
healthy therapy. And then we would go through these cycles, and I was labeling them as rupture and repair. So rupture being, there's some kind of moment of misattunement or hurt or harm or something that then needs a repair in the relationship. And that in healthy relationships, a lot of healing and closeness can come from those repair moments. Looking back now, what I see is cycles of seduction,
mm,
that there were moments of abuse, and then I was distressed, and then there were performative apologies, performative vulnerabilities to bring me back.
mhm.
And that I thought that, because it mapped onto this idea that she was explaining to me about psychotherapy, I thought that this was what rupture and repair was, and it really
Right.
never was.
Well, and it's also hard to see performative repair, I think is how you termed it, for what it is, unless you've gone through that as a pattern and the ultimate outcome is that the repair never really happens. There's a promise of repair or a promise of different action or a promise of a different behavior. And when that doesn't come through and doesn't pan out over and over, you start to get it that it's performative. And so sometimes it can take a while for that to happen. You talked about the term seduction. You don't mean in terms of sexual seduction. You talk about is sort of a more emotional seduction. Why was she doing that? What was important for her, do you think, in her seducing you back into the what she called a therapeutic process?
I think what she was feeding off of me for was adoration, and
Mm,
the feelings that she got to have from me when I would be in a state of idealizing her, seeing her as good and perfect and wonderful and special. And, rather than sort of holding that as, of course, untrue,
right.
you know, rather than sitting in some humility and holding that as, of course, untrue, that she was, you know, flawed and wounded like the rest of us. I think she wanted to use that feeling to feel that it was the case and that I was seeing her clearly and that I was right about her, unlike her own children and whoever else who didn't adore her sufficiently for her own standards. And so I think when I say seduction, the experience was come back and see me as wonderful, come back and be close to me in a way that makes me feel like I really am as wonderful and spectacular as you feel I am in these moments.
It sounds like she was engaged in some pretty profound denial about who she was. And that's what I'm picking up. But of course, you and I can't sit here and decide what she was doing necessarily. But so tell me, as a 15-year-old, that's when you started, you idealized her. She jumped in as your mommy, took care of you. It sounds like you sort of, or you said you sort of modeled yourself after her. By the time you get to be an adult and you're recognizing that this is all wrong, what does that do to you as a person who's done that in such formative years?
It was incredibly confusing. Of course, by that time I was in training to be a therapist. And so naturally, the question arises pretty organically. What the hell was I doing in clinical training? Was I there because I was fashioning myself after my abusive therapist who wanted me to be her child and be like her and aspire to be like her?
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to grapple with that. What I feel most resonates with me now. I can't, of course, deny that there was an element of that. I suspect that there was. What it feels more like, though palpably, is that because I was headed towards being a therapist, that's part of why she picked me for this, that there was an element of similarity to herself in ways maybe her own children were not, or, whatever the case may be, that I came in with, that she saw as an opportunity to create this kind of fake kinship relationship with me. But by the time I, as you're describing, sort of came out the other side of this really long tunnel, I was in crisis about most of myself, most of the things that I thought I knew because I had based them on things that she knew, things that she had told me or secured for me, or sort of straps that she had tightened for me in, meaning and self and identity. And it all came into question. It was all corrupted.
And that's true for lots of people, even if they weren't 15 when it all started. I think for you, it probably was a little bit more intense just because of that. You really had no prior trauma experience of adult self. So you are now a therapist. How has your experience of therapy harm impacted on how you do therapy?
Enormously. There's just nowhere to go but humility. There's absolutely nowhere to go. Because I can't rest on the idea that therapy is inherently good or that therapists are inherently good. And being in the field has only sort of corroborated the fact that those things are not the case, right? This is a system that we have built that is intended to serve some function, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does catastrophic,
Harm.
damage,
Yeah.
harm. And so much of it is so bad for so many people, the clients and the therapists. So there's no format, there's no modality, there's no type, length, duration, there's nothing about it that I feel like I get to hold on to and say, and this makes me good, right? This means I'm a good one. I'm one of the good ones. There isn't something like that. And so you have to constantly be asking the question that can't ever be answered. And because it's irresponsible to answer it, it's irresponsible to decide, you know what, I'm safe from doing harm. I'm not ever safe from doing harm.
No, nobody is. And that is the, as you said, that is the humility of being a person, a human being. We are
They
always
train it right
capable.
out of us.
Sorry?
They train it right out of us.
Who trained it right out of us? Do
Clinical
these
training.
clinical,
Clinical.
what do they train out of you?
Well, it's an indoctrination into an unearned feeling of power, that you're right and you get to decide, and you can feel secure in your goodness if you follow the rules.
Or if you can make people perceive, or you think, or you are in denial about how you are or are not following the rules. That's the problem with being a human, right? There's just so many ways we can trick ourselves into thinking we're doing one thing when we're actually doing another. You're reminding me of, I at one point way back, I took a counseling course on how to work with people who'd been sexually abused, and it didn't make me a counselor. It was like a workshop for several weeks. But I remember case studies coming up and listening in horror as people were deciding what to do with this person in the case study. And of course, I'm like, I want to ask all these questions, what about this? And what about, how did you feel here? And what about, but they weren't, they were just jumping in and they were making decisions. And I remember the distinct feeling of my jaw dropping to the ground over and over and over at the audacity of believing that you could make those decisions for another human being. It's always stuck with me. And so part of what you're talking about here reminds me of that. We need to take another little break, but we'll be right back, folks. Don't go away.
Tanuyap. Quiget Yuans Quiensna. Hi, everybody. My name is Quiget Yuans. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation and the Yagalanas clan of the Haida Nation. You're listening to Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We live, work, play, and broadcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox. Rethreading Madness is coming up to its 6th anniversary of being on air. We produce and air each week out of CFRO 100.5 FM on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. RTM was one of the first radio programs to focus on mental health issues here in Canada, in an area swamped with statements from therapists rooted in colonial ideas about mental health and trained in the DSM. RTM works to ensure that the voices of those with lived experience have agency and opportunity to define who they are and what is true for them. Who listens to us? Beyond those with lived experience, our audience includes their friends and partners, along with therapists, counselors, and students of psychology. Since 2022, all of our programs have been uploaded to the Mental Health Radio Network and can be downloaded from all podcast platforms. So if this show was of interest to you, you might find the rest of our programs informative as well. You can find them by searching for Rethreading Madness wherever you listen to your podcasts.
You hear this? A lot of people call this rock and roll swings. This is done with the, let's see, with the left hand, yeah. And the right hand fits in with something like this here. Here we go now.
Yeah, it's called rock and roll, and you can hear all about it on Rock Talk. Discover the hidden but enchanting side of the music. Friday mornings at 9 o'clock.
Oh, if that isn't enchanting, nothing is. Go ahead, kids. Dance. Go crazy.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, speaking with Natalie Russ about her work, but also we're about to talk about the Therapy Harm Resistant Project. So, Natalie, tell us what that is. This is something you've started.
Yes, this is an advocacy and support endeavor to address therapy harm as a disavowed reality in the mental health field. Therapy harm survivors coming out of this catastrophic experience, I think often find they have absolutely nowhere to go. You know,
Mhm.
there is TEL, which has just done an unbelievable service for all of us.
Well, let's just stop there and let people know what TEL is, because not everybody's going to know. So, do you want to describe what TEL is, or shall
Can I
I?
let you describe what TEL is?
Yes, I can. TEL is the Therapy Exploitation Link Line. It's actually been around for 40 years. And in full disclosure, I am one of the volunteers that responds to emails going in by survivors of therapy abuse and exploitation. And you're right, TEL has done an incredible job. And I've only been around for 6 of those 40 years. And so, certainly people who've come before me and are still there have been doing this work for eons, long before email, long before websites and able to Google or use a hashtag or anything. They were working with people around the globe. I have no idea how. But their website is therapyabuse.org, and they have a full stock of resources and papers and books and free books that you can download, and access to podcasts and resources like lists of lawyers, etc., that can help you out. So for survivors of therapy abuse and exploitation, TEL is sort of, in my opinion, the go-to place to get support and help. And they do ongoing support for survivors via email as well. So that's what TEL is. So I'm sorry, we've interrupted your flow. So if you can get back there, that'd be great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And, you know, we need to honor the enormous gift of what they've given survivors. I mean, that's where I turned.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I turned to TEL when I figured out what to Google, and I found the website, and quite literally there was nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I just feel like survivors deserve everything. Survivors deserve social media accounts and groups and articles and books,
Yes.
and anything and everything in any media, with all accessibility, with all kinds of robust supports. And so, you know, at the Therapy Harm Resistance Project, we're creating and platforming content and resources for survivors, for clients who want to understand better how to protect themselves in therapy,
Right.
you know, even if they haven't experienced harm yet or don't know if they have. Also for therapists who might be trying to support survivors in subsequent therapies, with which often become very, very fraught.
Mm-hmm.
Therapists are absolutely not trained to support survivors of therapy harm in the next therapy or subsequent therapies.
No, no, and of course, one of the biggest things that I find, and certainly was the biggest thing for me coming out of therapy abuse, was that um, intimacy becomes the trigger, right? You can't, you need to trust your therapist for it to work, but trusting that therapist and allowing for any kind of emotional intimacy, by you, in terms of being vulnerable to another person, was so triggering that it was very, very hard. And most therapists are coming into it believing their clients are just going to trust them, and that's just simply not true with somebody who's gone through therapy harm.
I think even maybe a step further, I think many therapists feel defensive if their client doesn't trust them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's actually something that's hard for therapists to bear, to not think of themselves as either trusted already or inherently trustworthy, such that they're just kind of waiting for the client to figure out that they're trustworthy so that they'll
Right.
trust them. I think it's very emotionally taxing, and not taught for therapists to sit in the chair realizing they may actually not be trustworthy.
Right. But that is kind of what you talked about, them learning in training, right? Is that they're inherently good, that the industry is inherently good. So the Therapy Harm Resistance Project provides information and content. How do you provide that content?
So it's on Patreon, which means that it's possible to give financial contribution, but it's absolutely not required. There's no gatekeeping based on contribution. Everything is accessible for free.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be, the hope is that we can create a compendium of different kinds of resources. For example, there's a community resources doc up there Also on my Instagram, which is Natalie Russ ID, a community resources doc, which has a bunch of different, groups and podcasts and, possible resources where survivors can hear other stories and connect with each other, just as a kind of place to go to look for something to hold on to, which again is something that I really needed and didn't find enough of. So I feel committed to, trying to be in coalition with others who are trying to offer more in this space, including you.
Thank you. What part of what you're talking about is peer support, right?
Yes.
The incredible power of and benefit of being in a space with another person that's gone through what you've gone through and has survived or isn't necessarily surviving. It doesn't matter if you're surviving very, very well. It's about being in the same space and recognizing yourself in somebody else rather than going through it alone and trying to figure out whether or not you are the only person on the planet that has ever experienced this. Let's talk a little bit about the movement that's out there right now. You talk about gatekeeping, and I often talk about it, and that part of why I started this radio program was to get this information out to people, this kind of information, because as I tried to do that in BC here, it just seemed like everything I put out fell into a black hole. It literally didn't bounce off anywhere. And what I got most of the time is that, no, we can't do that because we can't, it's confidential. You can't put you in touch with other clients or, yada, yada. And of course, gatekeeping has helped the mental health industry be able to keep a lid on this kind of harm. And I think maybe, believing somehow that it wasn't as big as it was, or somehow it wasn't as real as it was, or maybe believing that the people who were talking about it or having experienced it were somehow lying or making it up or whatever excuse they gave. But that gate is wide open, it seems to me right now. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the movement that's happening?
Mm-hmm. So I connect this back to the idea that, we're in a culture that says if you're traumatized, the solution is to go to therapy.
Mm.
But if you're traumatized by therapy, the solution is still to go to therapy.
Right.
And then you might get traumatized again because therapists are not trained to help people who've been traumatized in therapy. So guess what?
Right.
Go to therapy again.
Yes.
You're continually rerouted back into the mental health system for the harms created by the mental health system. And of course, people are starting to find each other instead. I guess I shouldn't say starting to, because I really don't know when it started.
Well, we know from Tell it started 40 years ago. So,
and my respect also to other movements, Mad Liberation, and other movements that are, part of this as well. This is sort of everyone's story together of, who society hurts and then what society does with those hurt people to cover up the hurt that it caused.
Right.
So
exactly.
I think we're, probably in part because of social media, having an easier time maybe finding each other or creating platforms or spaces where we can do some real movement building and storytelling. And I think I'm even just in the sort of short time that I've been part of this, I have felt momentum growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think social media platforms open that gate wide. And I often talk about the Reddit platform that has grown exponentially from 14 to 16,000 members in just a month or two.
Wow.
It is exponential, of course, and it's going to continue being exponential. And it's not just North America. Those platforms reach all over the globe. And so we are seeing the same survivors here in North America going through exactly the same things. And with therapists, abusive therapists doing the same kind of harm in Norway and the UK and Mexico, in Romania, in Australia, in, you name it, the same thing is happening. And I think that it's really not that hard to understand why. You have people who are professionals with an enormous amount of power and authority, who are going to attract people who love power and authority and who also can enjoy the fact that they get to define what's true for their victims. And of course, you talk about, if somebody is harmed by therapy, that they're told to go to therapy. And if they're harmed by that therapist, to go back to another therapist. And what we have is a system where your harm is only real, or what you decide about that harm or how you define it is only real and bona fide as another therapist defines it as such. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're talking about here in terms of this movement is that survivors are taking that back in the same way psychiatric survivors took it back, in the same way people in the LGBTQ community took it back, the right to define themselves. We survivors are taking back the right to define themselves and not necessarily going to therapists to find that healing, because so many of them simply cannot do that.
Mm-hmm. It's really powerful. It's really powerful to, even just for myself, to have found other survivors. Therapy harm, I think for so many of us, happens alone in a room with a therapist. You're alone in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And in every subsequent therapy, you're alone in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about busting the room open and, or bringing everybody in, or whatever the metaphor is, but not being alone in the room anymore that feels necessary and vital.
Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. So let's talk about some of the forums that we know about that are out there. There's certainly the Therapy Harm Resistance Project. And where can people find that again?
Yeah, thank you. Let me get the link. That would be patreon.com/therapyharm.
Okay. If they Googled therapy harm, would they eventually find you?
I'm actually not sure about the search engine optimization that I have accomplished.
That's okay. But if they search Natalie Russ therapy harm Patreon, they would probably find you.
Yes. And if you come to my Instagram, it's linked there too.
Okay. All right. That's great. So the other things are, there are Facebook pages that if you Google the hashtag therapy abuse, all one word, and Facebook, you will probably come across those ones as well. There are also at least two subreddits that I know of. One is Therapy Critical and Therapy Abuse. And I'm sure there are more. I believe there's another one on Quora, but I haven't been there. I don't know about that one.
I believe there is as well.
Right. Now, if you just go to Google and Google the hashtag therapy abuse, you will come across more stuff. And I remember, trying to find stuff back in 2009, I think. And it was really, really hard. I have no idea how eventually I found the Advocate web or Tell. I don't know. I remember stumbling across it at some point and feeling like my world finally opened up. But there are places to find it. And if you're listening to this program and you simply cannot find information about it, just write us here at Rethreading Madness, and we will point you in the direction of help and support and more information. So, Natalie, thank you so much for coming and chatting with me. I feel like this program went by so fast. I
agree.
I can't believe I'm saying that. We have to go, but we have to go. So thank you. And full disclosure, Natalie and I are doing some work together, and I'm really looking forward to continuing that work. It's a very important work, and it's a little bit different than what we've talked about here, but hopefully it will have a huge impact on people around the globe. So thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Bernadine.
Okay. And we'll be right back, folks.
Leave them all behind. Everyone Nobody can stop you. You were never broken. You were only hoping it would end. Keep your body well. Drinking lots of water. Always look ahead. Don't you wait for nothing. Nobody can stop you. You were never broken. You were only hoping for a friend. All they want is for you to fail. But you won't be defeated. You'll stand on that mountain. You'll look down at the valley. Every step you've taken, nobody can stop you. You were never broken. You were always holding out for this.
And that's our show. My thanks to Natalie Russ for chatting with me about therapy harm. Remember, if you have listened to this program and need resources, please do not hesitate to contact us through our website. Music today was by Ulrich, Jelly Roll, and Arden. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do. When I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, sure